The cold, sterile air of the courtroom did little to chill the spectacle unfolding within. It wasn't the divorce itself that had the gossips whispering, it was the audacity. Richard Sterling, a titan of the tech industry, didn't just show up to dissolve his 20-year marriage. He made an entrance. On his arm was not a lawyer, but a woman half his age, her hand possessively intertwined with his. They walked not with shame, but with the triumphant air of victors claiming their spoils. Across the room, his wife Catherine sat alone, a study in quiet grey, seemingly already defeated. But in the silent halls of justice, victory is not decided by the loudness of one's arrival, but by the devastating power of the truth waiting to be spoken. The polished oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a soft, expensive sigh, a sound completely at odds with the jarring image that entered. Richard Sterling, founder and CEO of the tech behemoth Innovate Dynamics, strode in as if he were entering a boardroom to announce record profits. He was a man sculpted by success, from his custom-tailored Brioni suit to the confident, predatory smile that never quite reached his eyes. He radiated an aura of untouchable power, the kind that assumed the world would bend to his will simply because he demanded it. But it was the woman attached to his arm that drew the collective sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Chloe Vance, a social media influencer, whose fame was as manufactured as her dazzlingly white teeth, clung to him. Her dress was a vibrant splash of scarlet in the somber room, a deliberate provocation. Her hand resting on his arm was adorned with a canary diamond, so large it seemed to pull her wrist down. They were a portrait of defiant indiscretion, a living, breathing testament to the reason everyone was gathered here today. Across the aisle, Catherine Sterling sat with a stillness that was almost unnatural. If Richard and Chloe were a raging fire, she was a pool of still deep water. Her charcoal grey suit was elegant but unremarkable. Her hands were clasped loosely in her lap, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she was the very picture of the scorned, discarded wife. The press had already written the narrative, Catherine the quiet homemaker, the supportive spouse who had been foundational in the early days, but had long since become a relic, an accessory Richard had outgrown. He was the visionary, the genius. She was Mrs. Sterling. Richard's lawyer, Jonathan Davenport, a man whose reputation was as sharp and merciless as his starched collar, gave a curt nod. He'd already assured Richard this would be a formality. A clean cut, he'd said over a $500 lunch. We offer her a settlement so generous it will make her look greedy if she refuses. The house a handsome alimony for a few years, a fund for the children's education. She walks away comfortable and you walk away free. The company is untouchable. It's in your name. It's your creation. Richard believed him, of course. Why wouldn't he innovate Dynamics? Was his life's work. He'd conceived it, bled for it, worked 100-hour weeks to build it from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. Catherine had been there, yes. She'd made coffee. She'd kept the house running. She'd raised their 2 children. She had played her part, the part of a wife. Now her part was over. He felt a flicker of something, not guilt, but perhaps annoyance at the necessity of this public charade. He wanted to get it over with and start the next chapter of his life with Chloe, a woman who understood the man he was now, not the struggling dreamer he had been. He caught Catherine's eye across the courtroom. He expected to see tears, anger, maybe even pleading. Instead, her gaze was steady, her blue eyes as calm and clear as a winter sky. It was unnerving. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of finality of dismissal. She didn't react. The bailiff's voice boomed, All rise for the Honourable Judge Annalise Robertson. Judge Robertson entered a woman in her late 50s with a stern countenance that promised no tolerance for theatrics. She took her seat, her eyes sweeping over the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on Richard and Chloe's joined hands before settling on the legal teams. We are here today to hear the preliminary motions in the divorce proceedings of Sterling versus Sterling. She began, her voice crisp and authoritative. Mr. Davenport, you may begin. Davenport rose, his movements smooth and practiced. Your Honor, we are here to expedite a painful process. My client, Mr. Richard Sterling, is prepared to offer a most generous settlement to dissolve his marriage to Mrs. Sterling. He acknowledges her contributions as a wife and mother. As such, he is offering the marital home in Greenwich, valued at $12 million, an alimony payment of $50,000 per month for a period of 5 years, and fully funded trust accounts for their 2 children. In exchange, he asks for a clean break with no further claims on his personal or business assets, specifically his company Innovate Dynamics. He said the name of the company with a certain reverence, as if it were a sovereign kingdom. He made it sound as though Richard were bestowing a great gift upon Catherine, an act of unparalleled charity. Richard smirked, leaning over to whisper something in Chloe's ear, who then giggled softly, a sound that was grotesquely loud in the silent room. Judge Robertson's eyes narrowed slightly at the sound. She turned her attention to the other table. Mr. Hayes, your response. Catherine's lawyer, Finian Hayes, stood. He was the antithesis of Davenport. Where Davenport was sleek and polished, Hayes was rumpled and academic. He looked more like a history professor than a high-powered litigator. He adjusted his spectacles, his movements deliberate. Your Honor, Hayes began, his voice calm and even. We thank Mr. Sterling for his offer. He let the word hang in the air, infusing it with a subtle irony. However, we must reject it in its entirety. It seems Mr. Sterling and his counsel are operating under a significant misapprehension regarding the ownership of the assets in question. Davenport scoffed audibly. A misunderstanding, Your Honor. The founding documents of Innovate Dynamics are a matter of public record. Richard Sterling is the founder, the chairman, and the CEO. Indeed, Hayes replied, his voice never rising. He is all of those things. But a title is not the same as a title deed. My client is not seeking a piece of Mr. Sterling's company. He paused, letting the silence stretch, drawing the focus of every person in the room. She is simply here to retain what is already hers. A confused murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard's smile tightened at the edges. What was this game? This was posturing a desperate last-ditch attempt to squeeze more money out of him. He felt a surge of anger. How dare she, after everything he had given her, try to tarnish his name and lay claim to his empire? He squeezed Chloe's hand, a silent reassurance that this was merely a pathetic delay of the inevitable. The stage was set. The lines were drawn, and in his mind, the final act had already been written. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. 22 years ago, there was no Innovate Dynamics. There was no Greenwich Mansion or Brioni suit. There was just a cramped third-floor walk-up apartment in Palo Alto that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ozone from an overworked computer. There was Richard Sterling, a man with a wildfire of ambition in his belly and a head full of revolutionary ideas about data compression algorithms. And there was Catherine Mallory, a quiet, brilliant software engineer who had just graduated top of her class from MIT with a dual degree in computer science and applied mathematics. They had met at a university tech symposium. Richard was the charismatic speaker painting grand visions of the future on a whiteboard. Catherine was the attendee in the third row, who after his talk approached him, not with fawning praise, but with 3 pointed questions that identified the fundamental flaws in his proposed architecture. Richard, to his credit, was intrigued rather than insulted. He saw in her a mind that was sharper and more systematic than his own. He was the dreamer. She was the architect who could build the scaffolding for those dreams. Their courtship was a whirlwind of code and takeout cartons. Their love language was beta testing and debugging. While Richard could charm investors and articulate a vision, it was Catherine who spent sleepless nights writing the elegant foundational code that would become the company's cornerstone. The first proprietary algorithm, the one that could compress massive data files to a fraction of their size with zero loss of integrity, wasn't Richard's brainchild. It was Catherine's. She'd conceived it for her graduate thesis. When Richard proposed marriage, he also proposed a business partnership. "You and me, Kate," he'd said, his eyes alight with genuine fervor. "We'll change the world. I'll be the face, the salesman. You can be the genius behind the curtain, where you're most comfortable." Catherine, who loathed public speaking and the glad handing of corporate politics, readily agreed. She loved him, and she loved the work. It seemed like a perfect symbiosis. The issue of funding was the first major hurdle. The venture capitalists they pitched to wanted too much equity, too much control. They wanted to replace Richard as CEO with a seasoned veteran and relegate Catherine to a salaried engineering role. It was Catherine who provided the solution. Her maternal grandmother, a shrewd woman who had invested wisely in pharmaceuticals decades earlier, had left her a substantial inheritance. It wasn't billions, but it was enough. A little over $2 million, sitting in a trust she gained access to on her 25th birthday. "We can fund it ourselves, Rich," she told him one night, spreading the trust documents on their cluttered coffee table. "We can build it our way. No board of directors, no outside interference. Just us." Richard was ecstatic, but there was a condition put in place by Catherine's financially savvy father before he passed away. He had always been wary of Richard's expansive, often reckless ambition. The inheritance was Catherine's alone, and her father had advised her to always protect her personal assets. So when they went to the lawyer's office to incorporate Innovate Dynamics, it was on Catherine's advice, guided by her father's wisdom, that they structured the company in a very specific way. A young hungry lawyer named Finian Hayes, recommended by one of Catherine's professors, drew up the paperwork. "It's simple," Hayes had explained, pointing to the relevant clauses. "The initial $2 million capital injection comes directly from a trust in the sole name of Catherine Mallory. In exchange for this seed capital and the intellectual property rights to her proprietary algorithm, the company will issue 100,000 shares of stock." He slid a second document across the table. This document, the shareholder agreement, allocates those shares to reflect his role as the driving force in business development and to give him the operational title he needs. Mr. Richard Sterling will be allocated 49,000 shares, or 49%. He will be named chairman and CEO. The remaining 51,000 shares, 51%, will be allocated to Mrs. Catherine Sterling in recognition of her full capital contribution and ownership of the core IP. She will be a silent partner. Richard had barely glanced at the numbers. He was looking at the line that named him CEO. That was all that mattered. A silent partner, exactly, he'd said, beaming at Catherine. "It's just a formality, a piece of paper. We're in this together, 50-50 partners for life." He signed the documents with a flourish. Catherine signed after him, her signature, neat and precise. She knew it wasn't just a formality. It was a fail-safe. A quiet acknowledgement that while she was giving him her heart and her genius, she was holding on to the key. Not because she didn't trust him then, but because she was pragmatic enough to understand that the future was an unwritten page. In the first 5 years, their partnership thrived. Richard's relentless drive built the company's profile, while Catherine's quiet, continuous innovation kept their technology years ahead of the competition. She worked from a home office after their first child, Daniel, was born, and then again after their daughter, Sophie, arrived. She was the company's secret weapon, the unseen engine powering the meteoric rise of Innovate Dynamics. Richard was celebrated on the covers of Forbes and Wired as a lone visionary. He never corrected them. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, he began to believe his own press. "I built this," became his mantra. The "we" of their early days faded from his vocabulary. He started to see Catherine's contributions not as a partnership, but as a supporting role. She was managing the house and kids, which in his mind freed him up to build the empire. He forgot about the late nights she still pulled refining code after the children were asleep. He forgot that the core patents that made their new products possible were filed under her name before being assigned to the company she owned. He forgot the source of the $2 million that had started it all. The distance grew. He spent more time at corporate galas than at the dinner table. His business trips became longer, his explanations vaguer. Then came Chloe Vance, a woman who looked at him with the same awe and adoration the fawning magazine articles did. She saw the titan of industry, not the ambitious young man who once nervously asked a brilliant woman for help with his flawed architecture. When Richard told Catherine he wanted a divorce, his tone was that of a CEO downsizing an underperforming department. It was a business decision. He had outgrown the partnership. "I will see to it that you are well taken care of course," he'd said, standing by the vast window of their living room, not even looking at her. "You won't have to worry about a thing." Catherine had looked at him, the man she had loved, the father of her children, and felt a profound, aching sadness. But beneath the sadness was a foundation of steel she had laid for herself 22 years earlier. She hadn't said a word. She had simply picked up the phone and called the only lawyer whose name she had kept for over 2 decades, Finian Hayes. Back in the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. Davenport, for the first time in his professional life, seemed momentarily thrown. He recovered quickly, his professional outrage masking his surprise. "Your Honor, this is a desperate and frankly insulting tactic." He boomed, his voice resonating with indignation. "Mrs. Sterling is attempting to lay claim to a global corporation based on some vague, unsubstantiated notion of early involvement. The fact remains Mr. Sterling built Innovate Dynamics. His name is synonymous with the brand. Her 20-year absence from the corporate world speaks for itself." Judge Robertson looked at Finian Hayes, her expression impassive. "Mr. Hayes, you made a bold claim. I trust you have more than rhetoric to support it." "I do, Your Honor," Hayes said calmly. He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a single slender folder. He didn't present a mountain of paper. He presented a single sharp spear. "I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit A." He handed a document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. A copy was delivered to Davenport, who snatched it from the clerk's hand. Richard leaned over to look, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "Exhibit A," Hayes announced to the court, "is a certified copy of a bank draft from the Bank of New York, dated April 12, 2003. It is for the amount of $2,150,000. The draft is drawn from the Mallory Family Trust, of which the sole beneficiary and signatory was, and is, Ms. Catherine Mallory, now Catherine Sterling. The recipient of the draft is a newly incorporated entity by the name of Innovate Dynamics." Davenport's eyes scanned the document. He couldn't refute it. The paper was clear, the bank certification impeccable. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, a seed investment, while appreciated, does not equate to ownership in perpetuity. It was a loan, a spousal contribution to a joint venture. It has been repaid 1,000 times over through the lavish lifestyle Mrs. Sterling has enjoyed. Richard nodded emphatically, relief washing over him. Of course, it was a loan. He'd forgotten the exact details, but that must have been it. A loan, Mr. Davenport? Hayes asked, his voice still placid. There is no loan agreement, no promissory note, no record of any repayment. Because it was not a loan. It was a capital investment, and one does not simply get repaid for a founding investment. One gets equity. He then turned to the judge. Which brings me to Exhibit B. He produced another document. Exhibit B is the United States Patent and Trademark Office filing for patent number 6/7/421, colloquially known as the Sterling compression algorithm. This is the cornerstone technology upon which Innovate Dynamics was built. The patent was granted on October 4, 2003. The sole inventor listed on the application is Catherine Mallory. A low gasp rippled through the gallery. Chloe, who had been looking bored, now sat up straight, her eyes darting from the judge to Richard. Richard's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. It was true, he remembered now. She had to be listed as the inventor for legal reasons, but it was his vision, his project. She was just the coder. A technicality, Davenport sputtered, getting to his feet. Mrs. Sterling assigned this patent to the company, as is standard practice for any employee or founder. It's corporate property. You are correct, Mr. Davenport. She did assign the patent to the company. Hayes agreed with a serene nod. She assigned her intellectual property to the corporate entity. But one must ask, who exactly is the corporate entity? Who owns it? A company is not an abstract concept. It is a legal structure owned by its shareholders. Richard was now vibrating with barely suppressed rage. This was a circus. His private life, his company being dissected by this rumpled, unassuming little man. He leaned forward and hissed at Davenport. "Shut him down, Jonathan. This is ridiculous." Davenport held up a hand to quiet his client. He needed to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes is playing games with semantics. Let's talk about the reality of the last 2 decades. Who has been at the helm of this company? Who has navigated market fluctuations, spearheaded global expansion, and driven shareholder value to astronomical heights? Richard Sterling. Where has Mrs. Sterling been at home? Raising their children. A noble pursuit to be sure, but not one that earns you a stake in a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The argument seemed to land. It felt like common sense. The man who runs the company owns the company. Hayes waited patiently for Davenport to finish. He let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. Mr. Davenport paints a compelling picture, he conceded. But the law is not concerned with pictures. It is concerned with facts and documents. Mr. Sterling has indeed been the public face, and the CEO, and my client has never contested his effectiveness in that role. She was, in fact, his biggest supporter. She was content to be the silent partner while she raised their family, knowing her investment, both financial and intellectual, was secure. There is no silent partner, Richard suddenly yelled, unable to contain himself. He shot to his feet, pointing a finger at Hayes. There is no partner. There is me. I built it. Me. Mr. Sterling, control yourself. Judge Robertson's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. Sit down, now. Another outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt. Richard, his face a mask of fury, slowly sat down. Chloe placed a placating hand on his arm, but he shook it off. Hayes remained unperturbed by the outburst. He walked back to his briefcase. His movements were slow, deliberate each step, building the suffocating pressure in the room. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "Mr. Davenport and his client are correct about one thing. The founding documents of Innovate Dynamics are indeed a matter of public record. They are quite clear, and I believe it's time we all reviewed them together." He pulled out a third folder. It was thicker than the others, bound in a simple blue cover. He didn't introduce it as an exhibit. He simply held it. "This," he said, "is the Articles of Incorporation and the original executed shareholder agreement for Innovate Dynamics, dated April 12, 2003, signed by both Richard Sterling and Catherine Sterling." He walked over to the defense table and handed a copy to Davenport. Richard grabbed it, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped it open. His eyes raced across the dense legal text, searching for the clause, the line, the single sentence he had dismissed as a formality 2 decades ago. And then he saw it, in black and white, unambiguous, irrefutable. Shareholder allocation, Catherine Mallory Sterling, 1,000 shares, 51%. Richard Sterling, 1,000 shares, 49%. The blood drained from his face. The courtroom, the people, the low hum of the air conditioning, it all faded into a deafening roar in his ears. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a typo. It was the truth, written in ink, sealed by his own arrogant signature. A truth he had managed to forget for 22 years. The silence in the courtroom was a physical entity. It was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the frantic rustle of paper as Richard Sterling read the shareholder agreement again and again, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves. His face, which had been flushed with anger moments before, was now a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. He looked up from the document, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, and stared at Catherine. She met his gaze, and for the first time that day, her expression shifted. There was no triumph, no smug satisfaction. There was only a profound, quiet sorrow. It was the look of a woman who was not winning a war, but simply ending one that had been waged against her in silence for years. Chloe Vance, sensing the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere, leaned closer to Richard. "What is it, Rich? What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice laced with a confusion that was rapidly turning to panic. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Davenport was on his feet, but the usual bluster was gone. He looked like a man who had confidently walked onto a solid-looking bridge only to find it was a hologram. Your Honor. This document, we contest its validity. It's 2 decades old. Subsequent filings, corporate actions. Judge Robertson cut him off, her voice devoid of sympathy. Mr. Davenport, are you suggesting this foundational document has been superseded? Was there ever a corporate action to reissue or reallocate these Class A voting shares, a buyback, a sale? Is there any document filed with the SEC or any other regulatory body that invalidates this shareholder agreement? Davenport opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew as well as she did that there wasn't. Why would there be? Richard, in his supreme confidence, had never seen the need. He ran the company as his personal fiefdom. The board was stacked with his allies, the corporate filings were rubber-stamped. No one had ever thought to question the foundational ownership structure because the CEO, Richard Sterling, had never imagined it was in question. His 49% stake, combined with his force of will, had always been more than enough to maintain absolute control. He'd forgotten that in the cold, hard world of corporate law, will is irrelevant. Only numbers matter. And he was short by 2%. Judge Robertson adjusted her glasses and looked down at the copy of the agreement before her. She read the critical passage aloud, her voice clear and precise, each word a hammer blow against the crumbling edifice of Richard Sterling's world. The allocation of the initial 100,000 shares of Innovate Dynamics Inc. shall be as follows: 51,000 shares to Catherine Mallory Sterling, and 49,000 shares to Richard Sterling. She looked up from the page, her gaze sweeping past the stunned lawyers, past Richard's ashen face, and settling firmly on Catherine. It seems there has indeed been a grave misunderstanding in this courtroom. The judge stated, her tone icy. She then turned her steely eyes directly on Richard, who was still holding hands with his mistress, a detail that had not escaped her notice. She delivered the line that would be on the front page of every financial newspaper by morning. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "it appears you've brought a guest to a private matter concerning corporate assets. This is a divorce proceeding, not a shareholder meeting. However, given that the primary asset in question is Innovate Dynamics, the court must address the controlling party." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle on the room. She turned her full attention to the woman in the simple grey suit. "Mrs. Sterling." The judge's voice was formal, but a new note of respect had entered it. As the documented majority owner and controlling shareholder of Innovate Dynamics, perhaps you would be so kind as to address the court's questions regarding the company's valuation and asset distribution. Mr. Davenport's initial offer seems woefully misinformed. The sound that followed was a collective gasp from the gallery. It was the sound of a narrative being violently, irrevocably shattered. Richard Sterling, the Titan, the visionary, the king, was none of those things. He was a minority shareholder. He was the CIO, yes, but a CIO who served at the pleasure of the board, which in turn served at the pleasure of the majority owner. Catherine. Richard finally let go of Chloe's hand. The contact, once a symbol of his power and freedom, now felt like an anchor pulling him down. He stared at his wife, his quiet, unassuming, forgotten wife, and for the first time, he didn't see the woman who made his coffee or raised his children. He saw the brilliant MIT graduate he'd met 22 years ago. He saw the architect of his success. He saw the queen he had never realized was sitting across the chessboard from him the entire time. Chloe looked from Richard's colorless face to Catherine's composed one, and the brutal reality of the situation finally crashed down on her. The money, the prestige, the power she had attached herself to didn't belong to the man beside her. It belonged to the woman he was trying to discard. Her canary diamond suddenly felt like cheap glass. Her scarlet dress felt garish and foolish. She had bet on the wrong horse, or rather she had fundamentally misunderstood who held the reins. Finian Hayes calmly gathered his papers, his work done. He had not raised his voice, he had not performed for the gallery. He had simply presented the truth, a truth that had been lying dormant in a lawyer's filing cabinet for over 2 decades, waiting for its moment. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. This court will recess for 1 hour to allow counsel to confer in light of this new information, she announced. "Mr. Sterling, I suggest you use the time to acquire a clearer understanding of your legal and financial position." As Judge Robertson swept from the room, chaos erupted. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for the doors. Davenport was frantically trying to speak to Richard, who was deaf to the world, his eyes still locked on Catherine. Catherine stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. She smoothed the front of her suit, picked up her simple leather handbag, and gave a small, polite nod to her lawyer. Without a single glance back at the wreckage of the man she had once loved, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, the quiet, steady footsteps of the true owner. The 60-minute recess felt like an eternity, and a split second all at once. Richard Davenport and a now very quiet Chloe were ushered into a small windowless conference room. The moment the door clicked shut, Richard's catatonic shock erupted into a volcano of rage. "What is the meaning of this? Jonathan!" He roared, his voice hoarse. He ripped off his tie and threw it on the polished table. "How did you not know? How did I not know? 51%! It's impossible!" Davenport, pale and sweating, fumbled with his own copy of the shareholder agreement. "Richard, my team did the due diligence. We looked at the current corporate structure, the SEC filings. Everything points to you as the controlling figure. This is a foundational document, an oversight of colossal proportions." "An oversight?" Richard laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "An oversight is forgetting to tip the valet, Jonathan. This is not an oversight. This is a public castration. She planned this. That quiet, mousy woman planned this from the very beginning." His mind reeled, replaying 22 years of memories through this new, terrifying lens. Every conversation, every decision. Her insistence on using her inheritance instead of taking on venture capital. Her suggestion to use that quiet little lawyer, Finian Hayes. Her lack of interest in a corporate title. "I'm happy behind the scenes, Rich," she used to say. He'd thought it was modesty, a lack of ambition. Now he saw it for what it was. Strategy. She hadn't wanted a title. She had the one that mattered most, owner. Chloe finally found her voice, a thin, reedy sound. "Richard, what does this mean for us?" He whirled on her, his eyes wild with fury and humiliation. "What does it mean?" he spat. "It means the penthouse you're redecorating isn't mine to give. It means the jet we flew to Aspen on belongs to a company she controls. It means that ridiculous rock on your finger was bought with money from a checking account that she is the majority beneficiary of. That's what it means." Chloe flinched as if struck. The transactional nature of their relationship was suddenly laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the drab room. Her currency had been her youth, her beauty, her adoration of his power, and his power had just been revealed as an illusion. She looked down at her hands, the life she had imagined for herself, the society pages, the charity galas, the title of the second Mrs. Sterling, evaporating like a mirage. Meanwhile, in a much calmer room down the hall, Catherine sat with Finian Hayes, sipping a cup of black tea. Her hands were perfectly steady. "You were magnificent, Finian," she said, her voice soft but firm, "just as I knew you would be." Hayes smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "I simply presented the facts, Catherine. You're the one who had the foresight to establish them 22 years ago. I've often wondered if you knew this day would come." Catherine stared into her teacup for a long moment. "I didn't know," she said truthfully. "But my father taught me to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I hoped our partnership would last forever. But I prepared for the reality that Richard's ambition might one day consume his loyalty. I never wanted to use this. It was my insurance policy. But when he brought that woman into a court of law, holding her hand as if to erase my 22 years of life with him, he didn't just ask for a divorce. He tried to nullify my very existence. He cashed the policy himself. The hour passed. When they were recalled to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The whispers were louder, the stares more intense. When Richard Davenport and Chloe re-entered, they looked like a defeated army. Chloe had taken a seat in the back of the gallery, physically distancing herself from the man who was no longer her golden ticket. Richard sat heavily at the table, his expensive suit looking rumpled and ill-fitting. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out emptiness. He was no longer a titan. He was just a man in a courtroom, staring down the barrel of a life he had completely misunderstood. Davenport rose his voice, now subdued, all the fight gone out of him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice raspy. "In light of the documents presented, the plaintiff, Mr. Sterling, requests a continuance to review his position." Finian Hayes stood. "Your Honor, we object to a continuance of the divorce proceedings. However," he added, looking at Catherine, who gave a slight nod, "my client is willing to table the discussion of asset division to a later date to be handled privately. We have more pressing matters to attend to." Judge Robertson raised an eyebrow. "And what might those be?" "Mr. Hayes, my client." Hayes announced, his voice carrying a new weight. "In her capacity as the majority shareholder of Innovate Dynamics, has instructed me to inform the court that she will be calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning." A fresh shockwave went through the room. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore. This was a corporate takeover. Hayes continued his words directed at the court, but clearly intended for Richard. "The agenda for the meeting will include a full review of executive leadership, a forensic audit of the last 5 years of corporate expenditures, and a vote on the future of the chairman and CEO position." Richard's head snapped up. It was one thing to lose the divorce. It was another thing entirely to be publicly and professionally executed. He was going to be fired from his own company, by his own wife. The finality of it was absolute. Catherine wasn't just taking back her share. She was taking back her company. She was taking back her life. The gavel fell again, granting the adjournment of the asset discussion. But for Richard Sterling, the true judgment had just been rendered. He was left sitting at the table, a king dethroned in his own court, the echo of the gavel sounding like the slamming of a prison door. The Innovate Dynamics boardroom was on the 50th floor, a glass-encased sanctuary of power overlooking the sprawling city of San Francisco. It was Richard's domain, a room designed to intimidate and impress. The centerpiece was a monolithic slab of polished obsidian that served as a table surrounded by 16 leather chairs. Richard had always sat at the head, the city his backdrop, the master of his universe. That morning, for the first time in 2 decades, the chair at the head of the table was empty when the board members filed in. They were a collection of men and one woman, hand-picked by Richard over the years. Allies, friends, men who owed their careers and their fortunes to him. They murmured amongst themselves, clutching their phones which were buzzing with news alerts about the courtroom drama. They were confused, nervous, and loyal to the man who had made them all rich. Richard arrived last 5 minutes before 9. He looked haggard, his face etched with the lines of a sleepless night. He walked not to the head of the table but to a seat on the side, a tacit admission of his new status. The room fell silent. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the boardroom doors opened. Catherine Sterling walked in, followed by Finian Hayes. She was not the somber grey figure from the courtroom. Today she wore a sharply tailored navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with a quiet confidence that filled the room. She was not a wife seeking alimony. She was a shareholder arriving to protect her investment. She walked directly to the empty chair at the head of the table and sat down. She placed her portfolio neatly in front of her and surveyed the faces staring back at her. Some were hostile, some confused, all of them wary. "Good morning, gentlemen, Miss Albright." She began, her voice, calm and steady, amplified slightly by the room's discreet microphone system. "Thank you for attending this emergency meeting on such short notice. I know there are many questions. Let me begin by stating the facts, so we are all operating from the same foundation of truth. She didn't mention the divorce. She didn't mention the affair. She was all business. As has been made public, I am, and always have been, the majority shareholder of Innovate Dynamics. For the past 22 years, I have been a silent partner, content to allow Mr. Sterling to run the day-to-day operations. However, recent events have given me cause for grave concern about the company's governance and a potential misappropriation of corporate funds for personal use. Therefore, I have decided to take a more active role in protecting this company's future. A board member, a long-time friend of Richard's named Gerald Finney, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Catherine, Mrs. Sterling, you've been out of the business world for 2 decades. You can't just walk in here and... Catherine held up a hand and he fell silent. Your respect is noted, Gerald. But your assessment of my involvement is inaccurate. While you may not have seen me in this boardroom, I have never been out of the business. Who do you think wrote the source code for our new Quantum Leap predictive AI? Who do you think holds the 3 key patents that our entire next-generation product line is based on? She let the question hang in the air. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The company's recent surge in stock price was almost entirely due to the revolutionary quantum leap technology, which everyone had attributed to Richard and the R&D department. Catherine opened her portfolio. I'm not a homemaker who got lucky with a stock certificate, she said, her voice turning to steel. I am the chief architect of this company's core technology, and I have watched from the sidelines as my work has been leveraged to fund a lifestyle of excess and recklessness that is now threatening the company's reputation and financial stability. She slid a file across the table. This is a preliminary review of corporate expense reports from the CEO's office for the last fiscal year. It details over $2 million in client entertainment and travel expenses that appear to have no corresponding business purpose. Private jets to St. Bart's extended stays at the Hôtel de Paris in Monaco, $500,000 in jewelry from a single vendor in New York, all billed to the company. She looked directly at Richard. These are not the actions of a responsible CEO. They are the actions of a man who has forgotten the difference between the company's treasury and his own personal piggy bank. Richard, who had been sitting in stony silence, finally spoke. This is a farce. It's a personal vendetta. Is it, Richard? Catherine countered, her voice dangerously soft. Was it a personal vendetta when you leveraged company assets to secure a personal loan for a $50 million penthouse? Was it a personal vendetta when you put your mistress on the corporate payroll as a brand consultant at a salary of $300,000 a year? The board was stunned into silence. These were details they had never been privy to. Richard's face was ashen. He had been caught, and he knew it. Catherine pressed her advantage. This company is not a toy. It's not a vehicle for one man's ego. It is a corporation with a fiduciary duty to its shareholders, all of them, and its employees. That duty has been neglected. That ends today. She stood up, her presence commanding the room. I am exercising my right as the majority shareholder. I am calling for a vote of no confidence in the current chairman and CEO, Richard Sterling. All in favor. She raised her hand. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Then slowly, one by one, the hands went up. First, Ms. Albright, the sole woman on the board who had always been marginalized by Richard. Then, a younger member who was more loyal to the stock price than to the old guard. Then another. They saw the writing on the wall. The power had shifted. Loyalty to Richard was now a liability. Finally, even Gerald Finney, Richard's old friend, reluctantly raised his hand. Richard was left sitting there alone, his hands flat on the obsidian table as the vote against him became unanimous. "The motion carries," Catherine announced, her voice even betraying no emotion. "Richard, your employment with Innovate Dynamics is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be sent to you." She then turned to the stunned board. "I am also proposing an interim CEO to guide the company through this transition. Effective immediately, I will be assuming that role. My first act will be to freeze all non-essential executive spending and to initiate a full independent forensic audit. We will reassure our investors, we will refocus our strategy, and we will move forward, stronger and more transparent than before." She stood there at the head of the table, no longer Catherine Sterling, the scorned wife, but Catherine Mallory, the founder, the inventor, and the new CEO. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was a restoration. The Queen, long in exile, had finally taken her throne. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The story of Catherine Sterling's boardroom coup became a media sensation, a modern-day corporate fairy tale. She was portrayed as a folk hero, a symbol of quiet strength and female empowerment. Magazine covers that once featured Richard's smirking face now ran cover stories on "The Silent CEO" and "The Queen of Code Who Reclaimed Her Kingdom." Catherine ignored the noise. She was not interested in becoming a celebrity. She was interested in running her company. She worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency that both impressed and terrified the old guard at Innovate Dynamics. She didn't rule with Richard's bombastic, ego-driven style. She managed with logic data and a deep, intrinsic understanding of the technology that powered the company. Her first week, she walked the floors of the R&D department, talking to the engineers not as a CEO but as one of their own. She spoke their language of algorithms and processing power. She identified brilliant, overlooked engineers, many of them women, who had been stifled under Richard's regime, and promoted them to leadership positions. Morale, which had been flagging, began to soar. The employees realized their new leader was not a corporate raider, but the soul of the company they had been missing all along. The forensic audit revealed the true depth of Richard's financial malfeasance. He had been treating the company like his personal ATM for years. Armed with irrefutable proof, Catherine's legal team finalized the divorce. There was no negotiation. There was a settlement. Richard was stripped of his remaining 49% stake in the company as compensation for the funds he had embezzled. He was left with a single personal bank account containing a few $100,000, a fraction of what he had considered pocket change. The Greenwich mansion, which Catherine had never truly felt at home in, was sold. The proceeds were used to set up charitable foundations in her children's names. Richard Sterling, the man who had everything, was left with almost nothing. His name, once a byword for success, was now a cautionary tale. Friends and allies from his former life stopped returning his calls. Chloe Vance had disappeared the day after the first court hearing, her social media accounts suddenly scrubbed of any mention of him. He was alone, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been his. Catherine, meanwhile, moved into a tasteful but understated apartment in the city closer to the office. She found that the trappings of wealth Richard had craved meant very little to her. What she loved was the work, the challenge, the act of creation. Her relationship with her children, Daniel and Sophie, who were both in college, transformed. For years they had seen their father as the dynamic, important parent and their mother as the quiet, background figure. Now they saw her for who she truly was. They visited her at the office, their eyes wide with awe as they watched her lead a meeting or sketch out a complex system on a whiteboard. They were proud of her not just for what she had won, but for the quiet dignity with which she had won it. 6 months after she took the helm, Catherine stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the boardroom, the same window Richard had used as his backdrop. But she wasn't looking at her reflection in the glass. She was looking at the city lights twinkling to life as dusk fell. The obsidian table behind her was no longer a symbol of one man's ego, but a place of collaboration and innovation. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her daughter, Sophie. Saw the new stock ticker. Wow, Mom, you're a rock star. Dad who love you. A small smile touched Catherine's lips. There was no bitterness in her heart, no desire for revenge. Richard's downfall was not her victory. It was the consequence of his own choices. Her victory was this, the quiet hum of the servers in the building below the challenging work that lay ahead tomorrow, and the freedom to define her own legacy. She had not set out to destroy her husband's world. She had simply refused to let him destroy hers. And in doing so, she had built a new one, brighter and more authentic than anything she had left behind. She turned from the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, ready for the next chapter. The story of Catherine Sterling is a powerful reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. It's a testament to quiet strength, long-term vision, and the irrefutable power of a truth written down on paper. She played the long game, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated wisdom and self-preservation. Her journey from a silent partner to a celebrated CEO resonates with anyone who has ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or had their contributions erased. If Catherine's story of quiet triumph and strategic genius struck a chord with you, let us know in the comments below. What part of her story was the most satisfying? Don't forget to hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own hidden strength, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of justice and empowerment. Thank you for listening.